Okay, welcome back, everyone. This has been a fascinating day of talks and discussions, and I'm very excited to introduce our final panel of the day. This panel is a case study that will synthesize many of the ideas we've discussed over the course of the day as it explores the incredibly relevant and topical anti-vaccination controversy. The moderator for this panel is Dr. Dan Marlow, the Evans Crawford 1911 professor of physics here at Princeton, and an esteemed member of the Council on Science and Technology's Executive Committee. And I'll turn it over to him to introduce the rest of the panel.
Oh, thank you, Paul. My camera is muted by the host. There we go. I thought they were trying to tell me something there. Okay, so welcome everybody. As Paul has said, this is the final session where we try to pull together some of these ideas. It's really a case study. When this was first conceived, we thought it would deal with the interesting case, at least interesting to us, of the public reactions surrounding, for example, the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, and the so-called anti-vaxxer movement. So we chose this because it seemed like it wasn't a political topic, at least not a partisan political topic. And this was before any of us had heard of COVID. So this was and remains a significant story and an interesting case study of what can happen when a significant portion of the public loses confidence in the scientific establishment. It now, in some sense, seems less urgent. And of course, the reason for that is the currently unfolding story surrounding the hope for COVID vaccine and just COVID in general really brings into sharp relief these tensions between science and the public, or public's perception of science. So this is really a whole lot more than we bargained for, but here we are. But in formulating this, we wanted to take a step back. Since the general outline of the former situation, the anti-vaxxer situation, has been extensively studied and well documented, for example, by some of the members of this panel, we thought we would like to start there. So when we were trying to get organized to do this, I sent around a note laying out some options, and Professor Kahneman, who's on the panel, said that no matter what we do, we will end up discussing the COVID vaccine issue. So we'll start with the more traditional anti-vaxxer question, and then the current situation will no doubt come up in the discussion, if not sooner. Okay, so I've mentioned the panelists. We're very fortunate to have an excellent set of speakers or panelists. And let me just say a few words about each one. I realized I could, talk for a long time about each one because it's really an incredibly accomplished group. The first person to speak will be Simon Levin. He is the James McDonald Distinguished University Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Simon has received many awards, and just to name just a few, it's a very long list, is the MacArthur Prize, the so-called Genius Award. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he received the National Medal of Science. The study of infectious diseases is one of his many interests, so he'll be talking about the science. The next person you'll hear from is David Robert Grimes. He's a physicist, a cancer researcher, and a science writer. He's affiliated with the Department of Oncology at Oxford and the School of Physical Sciences at Dublin City University, and he is zooming in today from the other side of the Atlantic. David's debut book, which was published last year in 2019, is entitled The Irrational Ape. It focuses on critical thinking and how we can, but often don't, use the scientific method to protect ourselves from misinformation and misunderstanding. Clearly, something that's very germane in the current environment. And then finally, Daniel Kahneman is the Eugene Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Princeton. He won the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics and received numerous other honors. He is the well-known for his bestseller book entitled Thinking Fast and Slow, which is, certainly germane. And then finally, I should mention that in 2013, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from then President Barack Obama. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Simon Levin, who will get us started.
Very good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to correct one piece of misinformation. I did win something called the MacArthur Award, but it was from the Ecological Society of America, not the G Award, as you'll conclude after hearing my presentation. So let me begin. My unabashed, educated opinion is that vaccines represent one of the greatest public health advances in history, and that the current increases in vaccine hesitancy and outright resistance constitute one of the greatest threats to public health. There's going to be a COVID-19 vaccine available broadly, I'm sure by mid-2021 or sooner, a tremendous achievement of scientific cooperation. It is going to be catastrophic if vaccine resistance undercuts that achievement. Now, some of the resistance is specific, tied to particular vaccines, but some of it is generic, as you suggested, fueling the very dangerous anti-vax movement. Lots of consequences, levels for vaccination for example, for MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, and DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, have been high, but there have been significant declines. For example, in a recent study in Michigan, compliance in 5-month-olds had dropped from 67% to 50%, a big drop. Now, some of that drop might be tied to COVID and people making fewer visits to doctors, which by itself is scary. I have a student, Amanda Harris, doing a senior thesis on this topic, but some of it is related to the anti-vax movement. Fewer than 50% of Americans get flu shots every year, and the numbers are worse in Europe. Some years ago, when I was lecturing in Catalonia, I met with about 30 students, asked them how many had gotten vaccinated for flu, and the answer was 0. Some of that is probably laziness. They didn't seem particularly opposed to it. It's unlikely economic, at least in the US, since it's basically free to most here or cheap. But for some in the US, it's because of their fear and opposition to vaccines. And I've talked to people who are in that category. Measles has been a particularly scary situation, and we'll talk about the reasons for that a little bit later. But in places like Orange County, California, in the Somali community in Minneapolis, in the Orthodox Jewish community in New York, and other communities in the Northwest, there has been significant drops and measles outbreaks. There's no clear pattern there politically or culturally that I can see, no clear political affiliation, unlike other issues like mask wearing, but it's due to the spread of false information, which I'll come back to at the end. In New York, at the height of the pandemic, 59% of the people said that they would get a COVID vaccine. So this is fallout from that. That's a smaller number would give it to their children. We're not going to reach herd immunity that way without significant pain from actual infections. This resistance and hesitancy has arisen despite the fact that vaccines are safe. They are rigorously tested and monitored and among the safest medical products we use. Now, there have been some incidents. The most famous was 65 years ago, the so-called Cutter incident, when the Salk vaccine was first brought out. It was meant to be inactivated through formaldehyde treatment, but there was a flaw at the Cutter labs. 3 other large companies did fine with it. Cutter was a small company. Their methods were defective, and that led to the production of what was thought to be an activated vaccine, but it contained live polio virus. It led to 40,000 cases of polio, 10 deaths, half of them in people that were contacted by people who had been vaccinated, and 165 cases of permanent paralysis. But this was 65 years ago. It led at that time to a switch to the Sabin attenuated strain vaccine, which in some ways had more problems, potentially. But most importantly, it led to much stricter monitoring and regulation. And the FDA then instituted extensive testing for any vaccines. There was another case, not as serious. In 1976, there was thought to be a pandemic of swine flu, and a new vaccine was rushed to market. 45 million people were vaccinated within 10 weeks. But the flu outbreak never developed into what was thought to be. And the vaccination was stopped because there was an increased incidence noted of Guillain-Barré syndrome, in which the immune system attacks the nerves. There were 53 deaths, and this led to increased monitoring every flu season. Now, this is 44 years ago, but the increased risk here was quite small, about one additional case estimated for every 100,000 people who got the vaccine. Nobody knows for sure still what the cause of this was. And the CDC now monitors for Guillain-Barré syndrome every flu season. And the results have been variable from season to season. When there has been an increased risk, it has consistently been the range of maybe 1 or 2 additional cases per million flu vaccines doses administered. And that has to be understood within the context that if you get the flu, you also are more likely to get Guillain-Barré syndrome, much more likely than getting it from vaccination. And that flu is associated with severe illness and death, and getting vaccinated for flu is still the best way to prevent flu infections and its complications. There have been 2 major events, the ones I talked about. There have been other minor events, largely compromised individuals, things like individuals passing out and being injured or killed from the fall, other rare events. But there is increased vigilance, and I personally have absolute confidence. Get the flu shot every year. As long as the protocols are followed with vaccines, I think they're perfectly safe and wonderful. That means we should not rush to market with a flu vaccine that is not, I'm sorry, with a COVID vaccine that has not been properly tested. Many millions of vaccinations are given every year in the US. Serious side effects are rare, very rare cases. Deaths may be on the order of 1 in a million, and those largely people with compromised immune systems. Of course, this could be undercut if we rush to a vaccine for COVID, leading to catastrophic reductions, not only in treating for flu, but in routine vaccinations for MMR, DTP, flu, and other things that people will be afraid to get. Just to close, where does this anti-vax movement come from? Well, opposition to vaccination has been prevalent ever since Edward Jenner introduced smallpox vaccination in the 18th century. Jenner's method was an improvement over what was called variolation, which used material from smallpox patients. Jenner's method used matter from cowpox, which is a much milder pathogen in humans. Today, vaccination is exceptionally safe because of the precautions and the multi-phase testing that we're going through now on larger and larger groups of people. There have been lots of myths behind these trends, namely that sanitation's been more important than vaccination, that low level of risk in the community makes it unnecessary to get vaccinated, that there are risks and costs of other kinds, that our immune systems might get overloaded. Young children get about 14 vaccinations. That uses up maybe 1/10 of 1% of their cells, and it may be less than that in that new cells are continually being made. There are unfounded worries about toxin, unsupported correlations between DPT and sudden infant death syndrome, and the notion that natural immunity might be better. It might be better, but the risk is much higher of getting protection by getting sick. There's also a libertarian streak, different than the mass situation. People on the left, people on the right who have, like Robert Kennedy Jr., Bill Maher on the left. Again, no clear political alignment. There's a general distrust of governments. But the greatest negative event was the publication by a British former physician, Andrew Wakefield, in The Lancet, claiming to show a relationship between MMR and autism. No evidence. There were multiple charges of misconduct, including financial conflicts of interest. He lost his license, but he still has lots of followers. He's still out there and made a film in 2016 and is a hero of the anti-vax movement. The damages have been incalculable. I want to close with just one thought. An interesting puzzle is that we overuse antibiotics, which is quite dangerous for us. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it when we're sick, and we underuse vaccines. Why is that? Why do people underuse vaccines but are willing to overuse antibiotics? The best hypothesis we can come up with is that you get antibiotics when you already know you're ill. You get vaccines, you're asked to get them when you're healthy. But I'll be interested to hear what my co-panelists have to say about that, which seems a good point to turn this over to my colleagues now.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So let's, I think we'll go through the introductory remarks or the remarks of the panelists, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So with that, David, please go ahead.
So, hello, can people hear me all right?
Yes, maybe if you're a little closer to your microphone.
I'll actually hold it up here just to feel like I'm at a conference and left my house in some stage. I brought a microphone with me. So we're playing make-believe. We're all enjoying it. As long as everyone can hear me now, I'll make a few remarks. Simon's points there are very, very pertinent, and I'm going to kind of pick up from where he went. He mentioned that there has been opposition to vaccination since the time of Jenner, and that is no overstatement. There's online, if anyone's interested, I won't put the slide up now because it'll kind of disrupt the flow, but there is anti-vaccine propaganda from 1888, from 1902, from 1917, and the kind of things they are saying, the kind of bits of misinformation they're spreading are actually essentially identical to what you hear now if you go onto an anti-vaccine forum. There's nothing new under the sun. The information delivery has changed, but the disinformation has not. One of the statements I quite like, I'd like to read it to you. In a bulletin of the World Health Organization in 2008, they had a beautiful statement about this. And this is before social media was a big thing. They said, how one addresses the anti-vaccine movement has been a problem since the time of Jenner. The best way in the long term is to refute wrong allegations at the earliest opportunity by providing scientifically valid data. This is easier said than done because the adversary in this game plays according to rules that are not generally those of science. Now, I think that not generally those of science is certainly an understatement. And we certainly know that since that statement was written by the WHO 12 years ago, social media has become a far more dominant force in how people get their information. It's estimated about 60% of people my age, millennials, are getting their information from social media. And we'd like to think that we're more savvy than we are. There's good information emerging from studies in the UK that exposure to anti-vaccine conspiracy narratives is the number one driver of vaccine hesitancy. You don't have to convince someone that vaccination doesn't work or is dangerous. You merely need to sow the seed of doubt. Once people are afraid, they make this kind of false risk balance calculation. They don't calculate between what they can see and what they can't. For example, they don't see people dying from measles diseases anymore because it's been relatively eradicated by a good vaccination program. And because they don't have that availability heuristic, and I'm certainly not going to talk too much about that because there's someone far more qualified than I to talk about it, they start comparing risks to things that aren't real. So they talk about a hypothetical or phantom risk, and then they compare that to the idea of not getting vaccinated, which they see as zero risk. And of course, that is not the case. The real risk and the real choice is between vaccinating or not. And this is where exposure to anti-vaccine conspiracy theory is very, very damaging. and very insidious. All these people that are who spread this disinformation have to do is sow the seed of doubt into parents that maybe don't know better, and they aim their misinformation at parents primarily, and this does serious damage. So we've mentioned Andrew Wakefield and the MMR vaccine, and the prehistory of that is interesting. I have to full disclosure, I've had personal dealings with Andrew Wakefield, and it didn't go very well. We didn't get on too well, I think is a charitable way of interpreting events. But his paper was obviously fraudulent and used modified data and all that kind of stuff. But what was interesting is this happened in 1998, the Lancet paper that came out. And this is obviously far before social media was a thing. But even then, the nascent anti-vaccine online movement already were propagating this. Before they had Facebook and Twitter, they were able to propagate this and buttress this kind of narrative. Now, that is a very pre-internet example that still is doing huge and untold damage today. We know that resurgence of measles has been seen all around the world, and Wakefield is still heralded and feted as a hero by these people. He's currently dating a supermodel and is getting about $1 million a year in speaker fees, so he's doing okay for himself despite his lack of credibility. But I'd like to give a more modern example where kind of puts, I think, to us the scope of the problem, and that is with the HPV vaccine. Now, in America, uptake of the HPV vaccine has been pretty good. The HPV vaccine prevents human papillomavirus, or several strains of it, and this is a virus that is fairly common. About 95% of humans get a strain of it at one stage in their life, but certain strains can lead to cervical cancer, penile cancer, anal cancer, basically stuff you don't want to get. And if you can vaccinate before that, you can reduce the incidences of cancer. Now, in my field as a cancer researcher, that's something it's really good. As Simon mentioned, prevention is something we really should be going towards. But a curious thing happened after the introduction of this vaccine. Now, this vaccine is incredibly effective. I won't get into the technicalities unless people want to later on, but it was unbelievably, it was a godsend to us. But in 2013, an anti-vaccine cohort in Japan started lobbying the health ministry with ideas that young women were being damaged by this vaccine. Within a year, vaccine uptake fell from 70% to 1%. The Minister for Health took it off the prescribed vaccination thing. There was death threats. It was a very unpleasant but very explosive example of what happened. In Denmark the year after, a similar, almost identical anti-vaccine campaign brought uptake from 79% to 17% within a year. And again, these followed a similar theme. It started off online, anti-vaccine groups lobbying local media, lobbying politicians. And in both instances, a documentary was made by a fairly credulous TV crew in one of the local news networks, which amplified it further and eventually caused a panic, which led to these massive falls. In 2015 in Ireland, the panic came to us. We had 87% uptake. Within a year, we'd fallen to 50%, and there was court cases and lobbying and everything else. Now, none of the claims being made were true, and all of them were following a script. They were following the same kind of things from online groups that were being regurgitated verbatim. Now, what was really interesting about that is the way the Irish took an approach to it, and this is where I guess our human framing matters. You have to stop for a second and think that why do people believe this stuff? Now, if you talk about the psychology of conspiracy theorists and why they propagate the beliefs they do, there's a lot of reasons. Some people are the simple narrative of good versus bad that appeals to them. A lot of them like the idea that they have special knowledge. A lot of studies of conspiracy theorists show that they feel they're too special to be duped. And they like to evangelize their beliefs. And they like to get the social kudos that comes with looking like they're an expert. You can put them in a room with an immunologist and a pediatrician and an expert, and they'll still think they know more without having done any of the work that these experts have actually done. You can see why that's appealing to someone's sense of ego. But that doesn't explain it all, because these kind of anti-vaxxers, these dyed-in-the-wool ones, are a small cohort. Most parents that did not vaccinate were not dyed-in-the-wool anti-vaxxers. They were concerned parents who were eager to do what was best for their children. And the emotive illusory truth of these narratives. They were hearing things about women being put into wheelchairs, about children becoming, entirely disabled. They became frightened. That's the information they had available when they went to think about vaccination. They didn't think about cervical cancer and how this could protect their children from an early death, because all they had was scary stories. So the Irish approach to combat this was very, very interesting. We recognized that very early on, and we took a two-pronged approach. One part was to get the medical and scientific community to form a vaccine alliance where we talked about those kind of benefits and we made information available to people that was high quality, independent, and very, very clear. But that was only half the battle, if even half the battle. The other half had to be the emotional front. And we got incredibly lucky with an extraordinary young woman. There was a young lady called Laura Brennan who at 24 had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer and contacted the health service executive and said, I'm dying of this disease. I would like to spend my time that I have remaining telling people why they should get this vaccine and not listen to anti-vaxxers. And Laura not only was brilliantly brave and strong, she was also photogenic, charming, engaging, and no nonsense at all. Her campaigning changed everything. And I worked on that campaign with her, and her strength was extraordinary. But she put a human face on a story. She would tell cameras, I am the reality of an unvaccinated girl. She goes, I'm going to die, in the next year or two, but your children don't have to. She said, this vaccine could save their lives. That was extraordinarily effective. Ireland now stands at 90% HPV vaccine coverage. The sad side of that story, and I personal aside, Laura was a very dear friend of mine and we were very close. She died last year on March 20th, age 26. She insisted that the camera crew record her funeral. She insisted they put it out there so no one would forget this is what happens. That worked. And I remember talking to her about that and saying, are you sure that's not a bit extreme, and she knew more than me. She knew better than me what people would emotionally respond to. And she was correct. I think the important lesson from all that is that we have to realize that we're fighting a two-pronged battle. It's not just enough to hit people with facts and information. That is crucial. But we have to realize that the propaganda that is spreading all this appeals to emotion. It appeals falsely. It appeals incorrectly. But it's very hard to combat that unless we are cognizant of it. I'm not sure if I'm going on a little bit, and maybe we should move on to Daniel, but I'll leave it there, and maybe in discussion we can come back to some of those points if I've made anything semi-coherent in that kind of live stream of consciousness rant.
Okay, no, thank you. I think that was actually very clear. Next, Danny Kahneman, if you care to say make a comment or two on this.
Well, a lot of what I was going to say has already been said. There is an interesting fact that plays into the resistance to vaccines, and it's an asymmetry between action and inaction. It turns out that when you present people with the idea that the vaccine would save 1,000 lives but would cost X lives, the trade-off is not 1-to-1, it's not 1-to-2, it is many thousands to one. And that is an asymmetry between doing and undoing. What I'm doing, especially when I'm causing my child to be vaccinated, is something that I'm responsible for, and responsible for the consequences of. What I'm not doing is an act of God, and I'm not responsible. And that asymmetry plays a very important role, I think, in the resistance to vaccines. It's been studied quite extensively, and it's not the only context in which we have this asymmetry between action and inaction. There is another factor which has already been mentioned, and that's in the context of antibiotics versus vaccines. The vaccine is given when you are not really immediately afraid of the bad consequence, but the immediate fear is of the vaccine. And a well-known psychological fact is that there is a very powerful gradient that the immediate fear plays a great deal stronger and is a lot stronger than fear of a delayed consequence. And that asymmetry again acts against vaccination. Another point that was powerfully driven home by the story of Laura is really the issue of what is the role of scientific evidence. And I like to think of it as the problem of what causes people to think that they know something. And those of us who've been indoctrinated in science have the sense that we know things when there is evidence for them, and that there is scientific evidence and that it's public, and there are sort of protocols that determine when we can believe in something and when we shouldn't believe in it. But that is really not the only way for people to think they know things. And indeed, people who have religious faith, they certainly feel that they know something, and they do not know it because of scientific evidence. They somehow know it, probably because of revelation and faithful transmission. Ultimately, what drives us to believe in things, and that is probably true for science as well as for others. If I ask myself, why do I believe in climate change? It is really not because of the scientific evidence. It is because I trust the people who tell me that there is climate change. And I trust these people, so I trust the National Academy of Sciences. But somebody who doesn't trust the National Academy of Sciences, but trusts a preacher or trust social media, has the feeling that they know. And the idea that you can convince people with evidence when the reason that they have another belief has nothing to do with evidence, but has to do with trust in some individuals who have given them that belief. We should not exaggerate the power of scientific evidence to convince. And the Laura story is a very powerful story in point. This is what caused Ireland to get vaccinated. It's a story of one photogenic woman saying, I'm dying because I was not vaccinated. This is the kind of thing that we have to deal with. And the recognition that stories are all powerful, and that actually stories are more powerful than evidence in convincing people, especially stories that are told by people that we trust. And trust is the essential part of it. That I think we have to recognize before we can successfully deal with the anti-vaccination movement, that it's going to be for different people in different communities. We have to think of the question of who are the opinion leaders? Who do they trust? And in the United States, there would be large communities who really trust their preachers. And then the problem becomes, how do we convince those preachers? But it's clear that unless we convince them, there are whole communities behind them that will not be reached, and that will not be reached by science, and that may not even be reached by stories, unless those stories themselves are endorsed by people they trust. So that's from the psychology of it. I think it's stories, and it's trust, and it's individuals, and it's emotion. Evidence is important for us scientists, but evidence is not what's going to do it when you're talking about the public at large. That was all I have to say.
Oh, well, thank you. That's quite interesting. So we can now open the floor up to questions, and I guess you can post those in the Q&A, and yeah, or just in the chat if you can't use the Q&A. If I may, I had a question for Simon, who talked about the safety of vaccines and so forth. But I think some people, and I probably put myself in this group, have a little bit of a concern about potential COVID vaccines being safe because they're rushed. You actually mentioned problems, Simon, you mentioned problems where we got into trouble because things were rushed. And clearly there is, shall we say, a strong political imperative behind rushing the vaccine. And I'm just wondering, what do you say to that? Do you think that could happen? How will we know if it's going to happen? Why should we trust the system as it now stands?
Well, it is a point I made in my lecture. You're absolutely right. That's why I said twice, actually, I think it's important not to rush the vaccine. Tony Fauci has laid out what the process is. I think if the process is a multi-stage process where you test first on rather limited groups of people, then you expand it out, and then you expand it out further. You're testing for two things. You're testing for effectiveness, you're testing for safety. The safety is, to me, the more important part here. Obviously, you don't want to marshal it out if it's not effective, but there are things that we won't know. For example, how long lasting the protection will be. That, I think, is not a reason not to bring it up. But in terms of the side effects, that's why we have this process. That's why the Cutter incident led to this process. That's why the 1976 Guillain-Barré scare led to this process. And that's why Tony Fauci has emphasized over and over again the importance of not rushing the vaccine to market. There are two reasons not to do that. One is, obviously, you don't want to put out something that's dangerous. But secondly, there's a fear among those of us who are involved in these considerations that this will not only cause bad side effects, but it will undercut future willingness to get vaccinated against MMR and DPT and the other things that we, DTP and the other things that we currently are getting vaccinated against. So you're absolutely right. It's a point which I tried to make, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to make it again, that rushing the vaccine to get it out there for whatever reasons, political or otherwise, would be a huge mistake.
Yeah. Maybe does someone else have here's a question. If you've seen the ads from the Lincoln Project, Republicans, that's a group of Republicans reaching out to fellow citizens of Republican persuasion to vote Democratic through crafting emotive stories in their video and campaign, crafted in the style as if told by people like them, might be a great example of individual stories and trust. Actually, Susan, are you able to just speak technically, because I'm having a little trouble. Simon, can you see that question, or any of the panelists? It's in the Q&A.
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. So would you like to, that's you, David, would you like to handle that one?
I think to reiterate what Daniel has said, we understand the world through stories. We understand, we use things as proxies, like we pretend we follow the science, but we really don't. We're still deferring to a story. The fallacy of anecdotal vividness is certainly something that happens with the anti-vaccine movement. But the argument then is, can we use that as a positive? Can we reframe something as a story to make people more likely to engage in a behavior that is net beneficial to them? I think yes is the answer. I think it's actually crucial. But the question about that is, how do we balance telling a story with, staying true to the evidence base that we have? because my fear, and I guess this is kind of an esoteric fear in some ways, is if we just deal with stories by telling more stories, that's important. But we have to have something else to offer as well, apart from a story. We actually have to have the story and the evidence base. Because sometimes you see people saying things, you see with COVID-19, you see well-meaning health experts making statements that are mainly true, but there's a tiny thing in them that's not true. And I always feel, ooh, that's going to be seized upon and you're going to be undermined. Like, we have to be on the scientific side of it. We have to be whiter than white. We have to both be correct and we have to have a good story. So it's not just about like the story, it's also about being correct, which is something the other side don't have to. They can lie all they want. We can't. And that's the only caveat I'd put on that. We have to tell stories, but we have to be bound to the scientific principles we all strive to uphold, because it'll be weaponized against us if we don't. So that's my minor and limited insight into that.
Thanks. Other questions? Well, if not, I actually wanted to come back to Simon, and I'm sorry to press on this point, but I think it depending on what happens in the election and so forth, it could become very important. We've already seen instances where the thrust of my question is, how will we know that the safeguards that you're talking about have been properly put in place? I mean, I would not have asked this question a few years ago. I would just trust the institutions to do this properly. But we've seen examples where people from CDC have, statements have come out that were hastily retracted. There was clear evidence of political manipulation. And how will we know that that's not happening? More or less, it really comes back to what Danny was talking about, the trust. And a great danger here, it seems to me, is trust has been undermined. I mean, just using myself as an example, I was the sort of person who generally trusted what the government said, especially public health officials. And now I'm not so sure. So how can we tell that it's good? This is a hard question, I think, but.
Well, of course, it's a hard question because we all suffer with this. I think it's the point that Danny made, which is we will make our decision based on whether we trust the people telling us these things. I've had contact with Tony Fauci for many years, long before the current crisis. I have full trust in what he says. So I'm not going to go by one person, but I think we clearly have a crisis in terms of knowing whom to trust in positions of influence. I will, of course, try and look at the results of the studies that are coming out. The vaccine companies have no interest in bringing out a product that's later going to make them the cutters of the COVID vaccine. So I think we're in a difficult situation where we'll have to base our judgment, certainly not on what politicians say on either side, but on what people like Dr. Fauci and others tell us. It's going to be a difficult situation. I just want to reinforce the point that Danny made about people making their decisions based on whether they trust the person telling them. We're seeing that obviously with the mask wearing, in which the scientific evidence doesn't play into people's decisions almost at all. So it's going to have to be based on trust in the people who are telling you, go ahead. But if Fauci says go ahead, that'll be good enough for me.
Okay, thank you.
As long as someone's not holding a gun to his head at the time.
I just wanted to add to this. What is happening, and we've seen this in the last two comments, we used to trust institutions like the government. What is happening, and you could hear that in the last 10 minutes, is we have to resort in trusting individuals because we do not trust institutions. I mean, this is really quite striking what is happening. That is becoming personalized because of the general loss of trust in what others are saying, and the loss of trust in institutions. The damage of that is incalculable.
There's also, if I could jump in on that,
Sure.
there's a huge political dimension to it too. So in 1923, the Soviet Union set up a whole department dedicated to disinformatia, or disinformation. And one of the things that we're finding fascinating at the moment, and one of my research interests is in conspiracy theories, and you come across all sorts of weird things. But one of the fascinating things that we're seeing that is also not new, but is just done in such a more elevated degree, is the rise of deliberate disinformation to undermine trust. So in the 1980s, the Soviets spent a lot of money on a thing called Operation Infection, where they tried to convince people that AIDS was a man-made virus and it was being spread around and all that kind of stuff. They've recycled that for COVID. In the early days of COVID, you had claims from China and Russia, because China have gotten really good at this too, perpetuating the idea that COVID was a man-made virus. It was the exact same script as AIDS they did in 1984. And what is fascinating is how that has manifested. That once you've let a cat out of a bag of something, disinformation, you can't put it back in. So you now see the rise of anti-mask protests around the world, where people are taking this half-baked stuff that has been politically, amplified because it was convenient for Russia or China to undermine trust in American or international authorities. And that undermining of trust has now been done on an industrialized level it has never been done on before. Back in the day, if you were in active measures in Soviet Union, you had to buy a newspaper or bribe journalists. Now you set up a Facebook page or you run a troll factory in St. Petersburg. The extent of the damage of that is incalculable. And I would say that the most important thing we can teach people in the next 20 years is how to critically evaluate information, a little bit of media literacy, a little bit about informational literacy, because if we don't, we are sleepwalking into a catastrophe. And that's one thing I think COVID has amplified for us as well.
If I just may interject, I think you're really optimistic about that, because in the age where you can manufacture pictures, where you can manufacture videos, when you can fake voice, how you can actually ensure that the information that you receive is valid is a huge problem, and it's getting worse. So I see, if you've raised that issue, I see very little reason to believe that we can overcome it easily.
That's depressing.
Yeah, I must say the motivation for this symposium was to help people, evaluate evidence, what is true, get a sense of that. And I mean, it is what it is, to borrow a phrase, but what we're finding is the challenge, or what I'm finding is the challenge is even larger than I had thought, that it sounds like it's going to get worse before it gets better, if it ever gets better. So this is an enormous challenge, but maybe COVID will restore faith in institutions.
But I'm even if given the chance, not standing in line to get the Russian vaccine that's apparently available now. Luckily, I don't think it's covered by my health plan.
Yeah. Okay, so unless there are more questions, I think we should probably, or any of the panelists want to make additional comments, we should probably move on. So let me thank the panelists for their, I found it very interesting, and thanks for taking the time to do this. So Sammy, or who
it's
is
me. I'll close this.
Naomi, okay.
Yes, so thank you, Dan, Simon, David, Daniel. That was fascinating. I think we all learned a lot. Actually, the whole day was amazing, lots to process. In my welcome this morning, I stated that our purpose today was to take some time to live together at the intersection of science and engineering with arts, humanities, and social sciences, to find new, refreshing, and impactful ways of thinking and doing on the topic of truth and evidence on the eve of the election, and at this moment of time when these conversations couldn't be more important. And I hope you agree, all of you who've participated, that over the course of the day, we've done just this, working through critical questions and raising probably even more questions, as well as possible opportunities to take action and make change about science and data and politics and society, about education and communication, information, misinformation, evidence and emotion, and importantly about storytelling and trust. I found it quite interesting that we started the day with a strong message about storytelling and trust from Dan Fagan in his talk on the Toms River Cancer Cluster, and we ended the day with, again, the same emphasis on storytelling and trust in the context of the anti-vaccination controversy. So, of course, there remains the big question of what we do next. We have an invitation to all of you on ways to connect and to move forward. But before we give you those details, I'd just like to say a few thank yous. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my extremely thoughtful and creative colleagues at Princeton's Council on Science and Technology. We're also known as the CST. This symposium would not have been possible without the dedicated efforts of Kathy Galvin. Kathy is our CST event coordinator. Kathy has taken care of every last detail and always with patience and grace. And for this, I thank you, Kathy. I'm deeply grateful to CST Associate Director Catherine Riemaki, Assistant Directors Paul Durst, Penelope Georges, and Daniel Pillis, and to CST Program Manager Joe Capizzi, and CST Studio Lab Manager Brendan Byrne, and to Bora Yoon, who is a fellow at the CST with us this year, and also to our CST affiliates and our Student Advisory Board, who are very active with us. I am indebted to Sami Khan, CST Executive Director, for her leadership in planning and overseeing the symposium. I also want to thank our marvelous CST Executive Committee, and especially those who contribute so much to planning the event and participating today, including Dan Marlow from Physics, who was the one who suggested truth and evidence as our topic, and as you just saw, moderated our last panel, and Mala Murthy from Neuroscience, who moderated our first panel. Thank you again to Dan Fagan and Carl Hart for enormously inspiring keynotes, and to all the other planners of and participants in our panels, Ali Nori, Sam Wong, Mike Lemonick, Stephanie Anglin, Matt Daniels, Katie Peak, Jen Schwartz, David Robert Grimes, Daniel Kahneman, and Simon Levin. Thank you for sharing your questions, your ideas, your reflections. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience who've joined us at this intersection of disciplines and at this critical moment in time to explore truth and evidence. We at Princeton's Council on Science and Technology welcome future collaborations, and we invite you to connect with us to explore other opportunities at this or other intersections of science and engineering with the arts, humanities, and social sciences, and to tell you more about how you can continue to engage with us and about some upcoming events that actually follow nicely on this theme. I'm going to turn it over to Sami.
Thanks so much, Naomi. And I second your thanks to everyone, to our keynote speakers, performers, panelists, panel chairs, staff members, everyone who worked on today. I wanted to mention Jason Lesage, Senior IT Manager from the Office of the Dean of the College at Princeton, who was also very instrumental in ensuring today worked well. As we noted at the start of today's program, the CST's mission is to advance STEM literacy for all at Princeton and beyond. And I think there's no question that today's symposium fit that bill. But I wanted to share that our work goes on throughout the year, including teaching and supporting rigorous courses, many of which are interdisciplinary, hosting a wide variety of programs like today's symposium, conducting robust STEM education research to contribute to what we know about best practices in STEM education. I invite everyone to learn more about the CST's efforts at cst.princeton.edu. And you can also follow us on social media at Princeton CST. This morning, we also mentioned that we want to keep today's conversation going. So to that end, I wanted to share that on November 9th at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be hosting Dr. Emily Oster, Professor of Economics at Brown University, as part of our Nature of Evidence series. Emily's academic work focuses on health economics and statistical methods. She's also written 2 best-selling books on data-driven parenting, Expecting Better and Crib Sheet. This e-lecture is free and open to the public, but registration is required. So you can please take a look at the link in the chat box for more information on that. We'll also be following up by sending additional opportunities to engage with their webs and with the CSTs. So please look out for our emails and do keep an eye on our website. On behalf of the Council on Science and Technology, Princeton University, along with Naomi, I thank you for spending your time with us today. We all look forward to seeing you at other CST events in the future. Take care, everyone, and be well.